Hi, everyone, and welcome to History 111 World History to 1500. We're a flex start class with a meeting plan, so that's why you have the FXMP that's included in the section title for our class. So, normally, under different circumstances, we'll be meeting every Thursday of the semester, with the exception of Thanksgiving, from 9:30 to 10:45. Unfortunately, today, as I tried to notify everybody via email, the server right now is being affected by a firewall error that's basically blocking our access to D2L, the website, email, unless you have it blocked. The whole thing's down. So unfortunately, I'm going to try to replicate as much as I can here what we would have done today during our first virtual class section. I'm going to walk you through the course a little bit, talk a little bit about why we study world history, and give you some of the tools that will be helpful to you as you're getting your feet on the ground in our first week of the class and preparing for your first assessment. One thing I will mention at the start today is that you do have your first quiz coming up that is due to be completed by the end of the day this Monday. So that is September 7th. Our weekly modules run from Monday to Monday, so our class has been open since Monday, and it runs through this coming Monday. Once you've completed all the week one content, as well as any assessments that are due during that week, quiz one in this case, then you would be able to move on to week two. So the way this course will work, despite the fact that we are largely asynchronous, we do have this one virtual session that we'll have each week. The rest of the week, you are free to complete the course content at your own pace. So as long as everything's done during the course of that week, you're able to do that whenever you have time, whenever the rest of your schedule allows. Ideally, you'll be able to join us for our virtual class sessions when we do host them on Virtual Classroom within D2L. Those recordings will post to that page under Communication and Virtual Classroom about an hour or so after we're done. So if something comes up unexpected, you're not able to join us for the session to engage in discussion about the primary sources, to participate by asking questions, if you have to miss that session, you will have access to it later on. So my contact information is here, jpariso at prairiestate.edu. The information to reach out to me is also in our syllabus, in the syllabus and getting started module. It's the first module that's there if you click on content in D2L. So first thing you need to do if you haven't done it already is to access our Desire to Learn D2L course page when the website goes back up. So that you can access those modules, familiarize yourself with the syllabus, and then start to look at the week one content. Another thing that you need to be working on is getting your textbook for the course. It's Ways of the World by Strayer and Nelson. It's a great resource. I think you'll enjoy the text. It is accessible. They cover a lot of really interesting ground in early world history. Do make sure that you get the fourth edition of the textbook. Ensure that you get volume 1. You don't want to be reading about World War II when we're reading about the Peloponnesian War. So make sure that you're getting the right volume. It's volume 1 through the 15th century. Our bookstore has access to copies of it. You can rent them, you can buy them, you can get them new, used, and also, especially since we're online, there is an ebook option that's available to be rented through the bookstore or through the printer, through Bedford St. Martin's Macmillan. So that information is also on our D2L course page if you're interested in getting a copy outside of the bookstore. I know they've added some hours, but I know some students have had some difficulty getting access to their textbooks this week. So let me know if you're in that boat and you run into any challenges there. So, big question here to start, why world history? I mean, there's lots of history that we could talk about. We could talk about American history. We could talk about Western history. We could talk about the history of China, history of Africa. There's a lot of different areas of history that we could be looking at. World history, I would argue, provides a wonderful grounding in understanding the world that we live in. In terms of understanding the breadth and depth of human achievement over time, the challenges we've faced as human societies over the course of the totality of human experience from origins to the present. There's a lot in especially early world history that I think can illuminate a lot of the experiences that we're going through now. So as we progress through the content together this semester and talk about a lot of the issues that are raised, the people who play a major part in world history, the major achievements, the challenges that people faced, hopefully that'll provide a good generalized foundation for your study of other topics, whether it be literature or science or mathematics. If you're going to become a doctor or a lawyer or work in a professional field, having a grounding in world history can provide you with a lot of tools to be successful in a lot of fields, even if you're not going to go on to become a professional historian. One thing that Strayer says about this that I think is helpful is that there's more to history than just Western Civ. A global present, as he argues, calls for the study of a global past. And one of the things that becomes clear as we look at the rest of the world around us, that some things that are dictating our experiences today are dictated by what scholars would refer to as a Eurocentric worldview. That as Eddie Izzard jokes here in his show from way back in 1999, I grew up in Europe where the history comes from. He's joking there, but it's a joke that speaks to an uncomfortable truth about the way that history has been taught for a long period of time, that all good things come from Europe, ignoring everything that's coming from other parts of the world, other parts of the Americas, Latin America, Africa, Europe, is engaged in a tortured relationship with Africa that is glossed over by taking a Eurocentric view. When we look at parts of India, parts of Asia, the great civilization of China, that's the longest lived civilization in the world today. In one way, shape, or form, we're looking at present day Chinese society that goes back 2,000 years. So there's a lot to the world than just Europe. So, speaking to Eddie Izzard's joke here, that's another reason why, we would study world history and make a case for studying world history. Which brings us to the question of what defines civilization. I mean, this is a question that I would normally pose to you, to get you thinking about how do we think about civilization? What are the factors that play a role in the formation of civilization? So I'm not necessarily going to answer this for you now. I would like for you to kind of think this one over, and we could talk about this next class period, next week, when we begin to think about what defines a civilization, because the first chapter of the text that you're going to be looking at this week looks at human origins, the story of earliest human beginnings, the story of migrations out of Africa, and looking at the appearance of first peoples and first farmers. So at least at that phase of human development, can we talk about civilization, or do we have to wait for chapter 2? Do we have to wait for the next phase of human development? So that's a question I'll pose to you, in terms of what defines civilization, and we'll come back to this and be able to chat about it next week when we have an opportunity to all get together in virtual classroom as a class. So another issue I wanted to raise today on day one is the issue of sources, how we know what we know about the past. And as historians, as scholars, one of the key things that we go to for evidence are what are called primary sources. So primary sources are the kind of bedrock of the work we do as historians to learn about the past. And primary sources can be a number of different things. They can be texts, so they can be letters, journals, diaries, newspaper articles from the time period in which the events are happening. Anything that's written down on paper or cuneiform that's carved into tablets or hieroglyphs that are carved into rock. Ultimately, those serve as primary sources because they tell a story from the perspective of people who lived at the time. Now, we can't take them at face value all the time. We've got to assess them carefully with a critical eye to understand the bias of the document. We have to understand the perspective of the person writing it. We have to understand if this person is writing about another group of people and that their perspective might be shaded by their experience as they're interpreting the experiences of others. We have to assess the fact that not everyone had the ability to be able to leave primary sources that are in text form behind. So not everyone is literate or educated, and some of that's on purpose. That's something we'll talk about over the course of the semester, how education is weaponized over time by a number of different societies at various times. And it may not just be what you're thinking in terms of issues of race, for example, if we think more closely to more modern times where, from my part teaching African American history, one of the things that we talk about is the fact that enslaved individuals in early America were barred from being educated because education was a path to freedom. So that's one part of the narrative there. But there's also a gender component too. For a long period of time, only men were considered to be to have access to education in terms of the expectations of their society. Women were largely barred from becoming educated beyond the most basic levels of education that somebody could have access to. So as a consequence, what do we end up with? We end up with a lot of primary source texts like journals, letters, and diaries that are generated by a very specific group of people that don't speak to the totality of the human experience. So we also then have to rely on other sources to get at the other stories that we're also interested in. And that could bring us to oral history, stories that are passed down from generation to generation over time. And you have to think beyond the game of telephone that you might have played at one point or another, because one of the issues there is that stories can change over time, but ultimately oral histories tend to be fairly stable over time. People tend to hold close to the original intent of the story, and usually only the best storytellers are the ones who are the keepers of oral histories in a society. So historians have found over time that those stories tend to be pretty accurate. And lastly, in terms of primary sources, we have material culture. So material culture can also be a helpful tool to us in terms of unpacking the story of the past, because we can use objects to be able to tell people stories as well. The other kind of source that you'll have access to this semester are what are called secondary sources, and those rely on primary sources to tell an overarching narrative. And the best example I can provide to you today of a secondary source is your textbook. So if it's written outside of the time in which the events happened, odds are it's going to be a secondary source. In terms of dates, one thing I will mention briefly today is that date terminology has changed a little bit, at least in terms of my own education. Used to be that we had BC and AD. This is all accessible in the PowerPoint that'll be available to you in D2L. But bottom line here is that the textbook uses BCE before Common Era and CE Common Era. It correlates directly to BC and AD. So that's the basic issue there. And then last issue I wanted to raise today as we're winding down, one of the a few of the resources that you have access to in the week 1 module have to do with our population growth. And as you'll notice, this is an interesting chart that shows how much change over time has happened over the course of human history and how quickly it's happened more recently. So as you watch the video resources that I've posted, it will hopefully help to illustrate to some extent how we arrived at 7 billion people in the world very recently. We're up to somewhere around 7.6 billion people right now, but it wasn't always the case. We had smaller numbers of people living in the world historically. So I hope you enjoy this week one content. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.